think. So I'm going to speak about some PDEs program, and the aim of this program is to understand the turbulent cascades, and so I'm going to explain what we are talking about by turbulent cascades. But first I apologize because I'm not going to explain all the background, all the literature, because these last 10 years it becomes a huge, there is a huge amount of papers in this area. And so I apologize because if I start with the story, then I will not speak about the mathematics. And I would like to show you how a very nice analysis operator theory may help to understand this kind of phenomenon. Okay, so it's from joint works with Patrick Gérard. We start to work together maybe 12 or 13 years ago. And the last part has been done with the PhD students. So Patrick Gérard is from Orsay, and Zihui A is a PhD student from Bonn. Okay. So our aim is to understand the turbulence. And by turbulence, there are many kind of turbulence for physicists. And we mean, for us, we mean transfer of energy from low to high frequencies. What do I mean by this? We have, for instance, we have a system depending on the time. T is a variable in, c'est pas ça. T is a variable in R. And let's say that we have a function defined on R across the unit circle. And you assume that you have an energy which is conserved by some system. I will give an example just after. You assume that this energy is conserved, so it does not depend on the time. And a way to detect transfer of energy from low to high frequencies is to prove that some HS norm for S strictly positive is unbounded as t goes to infinity. You imagine that you have this sum, which is a constant in time. That one goes to, well, is unbounded as t goes to infinity. So it means that you have transfer of these Fourier coefficients becomes large as n becomes large from time to time. It may happen that you have well, in fact, it happens that the sublimit of such quantity is infinite, and the nth limit, in fact, is bounded. So it's you don't have necessarily a limit. Okay. It can be something. It's why it's called a turbulence cascade, because you can have a cascade. It can goes from enlarge the Fourier coefficients, and then it goes down. Okay. And you imagine that the dependence in T is driven by some ODEs or PDEs. Okay. And to precise the goal of the work, and in fact, what we would like to understand first is how interaction between Fourier coefficient interfere on this phenomenon. So I'm going to explain now more precisely that. Okay. So the motivation goes back to the work we did at the beginning of our collaboration with Patrick. We introduced the cubic-Zeghe equation 13 years ago. So it's a very simple ODE, and it's given by this formula. It's I dt u equal pi of modulus of u square u, and it's the variable t is in R, and the variable in space is on the torus. And pi is just the Zeger projection or the Riesz projection. So it's just you take the Fourier expansion of your function and you project it on holomorphic function in the unit disk. So, okay. So first I'm going to give you some basic facts about this small ODE. So it's not the part I think could be very interesting for you, but anyway, we are obliged to do that. So first, we prove that it is well posed on HS. So HS is the Sobolev space defined in the previous slide. And we prove that it is well posed on HS for S larger than 1/2. And the trick is that if we denote by ST of U naught the solution, when I say well posed, it means that you have existence of a solution when you take your initial datum U naught, and that it is uniquely defined. So you take this notation for the solution with initial datum, let's say in U naught in HS plus of the torus. And what we proved is that there exists a dense G delta subset of L2 plus. When I put the plus, it's just to emphasize that you have Fourier, you have a holomorphic function. In fact, it is the Hardy space here. So there is a G delta dense subset of smooth function such that for any initial datum, you have the H1/2 norm, which is preserved. It's a constant. But the sublimit of the HS norm for S larger than 1/2 is plus infinity. So it's a kind of turbulence. What we mean by turbulence. Okay. And in fact, it was a problem raised by Bourgain in 2000 about the cubic NLS, and it was one of the first results in this direction. And in fact, the question does not have any answer at the moment. Anyway, okay. So the restriction of this result is that in fact it has an empty interior, since it does not contain any rational function. So it can be, it is dense, but it is small in some sense. And we do not have any explicit example of such a function, such an initial datum giving rise to such a solution. Okay. What we proved is that there is an exponential bound for the growth of the HS norm. And in fact, what we were able to prove here is that, in fact, we have a super polynomial growth. What does it mean? It means that when you take U naught in G, for any M, you can prove that the limit sup of the HS norm over any T to the M is equal to plus infinity. So that's the things I told the super polynomial growth. So it's almost optimal, since this bound, this exponential bound, is almost optimal, and we don't know if it is really optimal. Okay. Okay. So when we start this problem, we start with this cubic Zeger equation. It becomes there are a lot of literature around it, and some physicists, Biasi and Efnin, introduced a family of, so Biasi and Efnin, last year, they introduced a family of equation, of cubic Zeger equation. They call it truncated Zeger equation, depending on one parameter beta. And so it was their goal to understand how the mixing of the Fourier coefficient, and also we will see that in fact this I'm just going to explain that in fact this changes the weight you put on the Fourier coefficient. And so it was natural for them to study whether the cubic Zeger equation was alone as the PDE satisfying some turbulence phenomenon or not. So pi is the Zeger projection as before. S is the shift, so it just you put 0 as the first Fourier coefficient, and you push the other Fourier coefficient, and S star is the opposite, you forget the first Fourier coefficient. And so here you form this strange term. Okay, so it was the first way to understand the interference of the Fourier coefficients on the turbulence. And so if you look at the beta Zeger equation on the Fourier side, so it's, well, first I should say that when beta equals 0, you recover the cubic Zeger equation. And so for other beta, you have this, this corresponds to the Fourier coefficients of modulus of u square u, and you have these terms in front of it. So when beta equals 0, it's just 1, of course. But when beta is different from 0, you see that if beta is close to 1, it means that you try to put some small coefficient, or some large, why not, in front of this Fourier coefficient and see what happens. Okay. And they have constructed example of solution as well as they construct example with exponential growth and also example with polynomial growth. But their examples are very simple. They just take an initial datum which is a rational function of degree 1. And after an analysis, they prove such a result. Okay, and they don't go too much further. I think there is still a lot of work to do in this area. And what we were interested in was also to understand the influence of damping. What we call damping, here we take an example of damping, the simplest one. We put a damping term, a viscosity term, on the first Fourier coefficient. Here it's the scalar, I denote this by, it is the scalar product of u against 1, so it's the first Fourier coefficient. And we expect, by putting this viscosity term, we expect that it does not allow turbulence, because in some sense, what you do is you take the first Fourier coefficient and you multiply by exponential minus nu t. As nu is positive, it means that you take small Fourier coefficient as t goes to infinity. And so you expect that it's going to smooth the function at infinity. And in fact, what we saw is that it is exactly the opposite. It seems to promote the turbulence. Okay. So, so I'm going to explain the result on this equation. In some sense, if you want to forget about the beta, it's not very important. what we are going to prove is a result which does not depend on beta, which is very strange, but at least when beta is different from 1. Well, I should say that the most interesting term, the most interesting case is when beta equal 1. Because when beta equal 1, you put 0 almost in front of all the Fourier coefficients. So that it remains to prove something about that. Okay, so as for the Kubic-Zege equation, you can prove that the momentum is preserved by the flow, so it's part of the H1 half norm, which is preserved. And we can prove also that it is globally well posed on HS for any S larger than 1/2. And this is just an adaptation of the proof of in the case of the Kubic-Zege equation. So if we denote by S beta nu of T the solution of the Dampf-Zege equation, of this equation, then what we prove exactly by the same method that done for the Kubic-Zege equation is that we have this exponential bound for the growth of the HS norm. By the way, so this holds only for S larger than 1, and this is not easy at all to prove. But it comes from, I will say later. Okay. Okay, so the main result I would like to speak about is that one. So unfortunately, we have to assume that beta equal 1, beta is different from 1. And maybe it's much more interesting because it means that this case is really different. So maybe it's better to not to be able to deal with it now. And so we assume beta different from 1, and we take viscosity strictly positive. And what we prove is that there exists an open subset omega, non-empty, of course, with a non-empty intersection with any HS, and for which this norm tends to infinity for any S larger than 1/2. So it means that you prove that adding a damping term promotes the turbulence, because before we just have that it's true for dense G delta subset, and it's not, the conclusion is not that one, it's just that these family of norms are not bounded. So it's not, it's much more powerful, but we don't know whether this open subset is dense. We just know it for small dimension if we consider some small subset of omega. Okay, so this is always open. You see that for beta equals 0, it holds also, so it means that the damping seems to promote the turbulence, since for the Kubic-Zege equation you don't have this. And okay, so I recall that we do not know whether there exists an initial datum driving to an unbounded HS trajectory for the Sobolev, the Kubic-Zege equation. And the most interesting case remains open, the case beta equal 1. By the way, the beta equal 1, it's called the truncated Zege equation. Okay, so and my aim is to explain how. I would like to explain you how we obtained this result, because the tools are very interesting, I think. Okay, so we argue by contradiction. So our aim is to prove that for an open set of initial data, you have that the norm of the solution goes to infinity. So you argue by contradiction. You assume that it is not the case. So it means that if you denote by v of t this function, then you know that there exists a subsequence Tn such that v of Tn is bounded in HS. And so up to a subsequence, since HS is relatively compact in H1 half, you can subtract a subsequence such that V of Tn tends strongly to U infinity in H1 half. And what we are going to prove is, well, what we are going to do is to find a closed condition characterizing the initial condition U0, giving such U infinity. So if we do that, we will, by contradiction, we will have an open condition on initial data, which gives the fact that the HS norm of the solution goes to infinity, right? So I'm going to collect all the information on this function U infinity. So you have to wait until the end of my talk to know, because it's really at the very end that it becomes, for me at least, it becomes really nice. Okay, at the beginning it's easy. You know, it's it comes from an easy computation that you have this momentum, this part of the H1 half norm, which is a conservation law. So it means that since you know that the solution goes strongly to U infinity in H1 half, then it means that you have this equality, right? Because M of U0 is equal to M of the solution at each time, and then you can go, you can let T goes to infinity and obtain this equation. So this is easy. Okay, now we do a little computation. So you take the L2 norm of the solution, you compute the derivative in T, and it's easy to prove that it satisfies this equation. This type of equation is called the Lyapunov formula, Lyapunov functional. And well, as easy consequences, you get that since this derivative is negative, then it means that this is decreasing. As it is decreasing, it has a limit, since it is positive quantities. Since it has a limit, you can obtain that this term is integrable, so it gives that this is in L2. And then you obtain that this goes to 0 necessarily. Okay. So this is the things I could say. That since the norm in L2 is decreasing necessarily, the norm of U0 is larger than its limit, the norm of its limit. Or if it is equal by the Lyapunov functional, it means that this is 0, so this is 0. Okay, so this is 0 in that case for any t. And now if you take the limit, I should say that in any case, you can prove by taking the limit here, as t goes to infinity, and by a little argument that in fact you have also this property. I recall you that when I take this, it's a scalar product with the functional one, meaning that you take the third Fourier coefficient. Okay, and I recall you that I have this property. Okay, so for the moment, it's just a basic observation and easy. You can give this to your student. And now it's going to be more operator theory. It turns out that for the Zeghe equation that it was natural to consider Hankel operator. And so I recall you that at least, the Hankel operator are not always defined by the way I choose, but anyway, it's the way we choose. So I denote by H of U, of symbol U. It's the operator descending f on pi of u f bar. And it's a realization of Hankel operator because if you look at the Fourier coefficient, the matrix is the Hankel matrix with the Fourier coefficient in the as in tri. So I mean that on the Fourier side, it coincides to the Fourier, the matrix whose coefficient on the anti-diagonal are constant and equal to the Fourier coefficient of u. Well, it's a strange way, well, it turns out that it has been easier to make the computation in that case, but you see that the choice we did is not linear, it's antilinear. Okay, and also, so we consider this Hankel operator, and also we consider it's shifted. Ku is the Hankel operator of symbol S star u, and in fact, it is also S star composed with HU, and it's HU composed with S. I recall US is the shift on the Fourier coefficient, and S star is its adjoint. And in fact, it's natural to consider HU and KU at the same time because the Hankel operators are completely characterized by this functional equation. Okay. So if you look at this matrix representation of Hankel operator, it's easy to prove that HU is Hilbert-Schmidt if and only if U is in the Sobolev class of order 1/2. And in fact, the trace of HU square is the norm of U square plus the momentum of U. So it's the H1/2 norm to the square. And so this is easy. You just compute this matrix composed with its adjoint, and you get that. Of course, here it's HU square that you compute because of the antilinearity of the Hankel operator. This one is linear. And also, since Ku is the Hankel operator with symbol shifted, it's easy to obtain that the trace of Ku square is the momentum of U. And in fact, I just want you to recall that we can recover the norm of U in L2 by the two trace, the difference of the two trace. Okay, so for the cubic Zeger equation, we have established this formula. This looks strange, but I'm going to explain why it is really interesting. So it's a long computation, which, well, long, at least tricky, which gives that if you look at the Hankel operator of symbol -I pi of modulus of U square U, it's the Lie brackets of two operators of BU against HU, and BU is this Q-symmetric operator, where here T is the Toeplitz operator. It's just the cousine of the Hankel operator. It's just pi of BF, the operator TB of F. And you can do the analogous computation for K, and it is the same, almost the same formula that you obtain. And it has been crucial for the cubic Zeger equation because it gives what is called lax pairs. For the cubic Zeger equation, if you compute the derivative of HU, then you get that it's the Lie brackets of BU against with HU, because what you prove is that this is BU against HU, and this it's of course by the Zeger equation is H of the symbol du over dt, since if you satisfy the cubic Zeger equation. So it's very important in PDEs, and it's not often to have this kind of property. And we were very happy to discover this a long time ago. And it's because it allows to prove that the cubic Zeger equation is in fact a complete integrable Hamiltonian system. I didn't speak about Hamiltonian system, but it turns out that it is a Hamiltonian system. And it is completely integrable. It means that, in fact, to solve this cubic Zeger equation, if you recall the formula of the equation on the Fourier side, for instance, it's something which mixes every Fourier coefficient. In fact, it turns out that you have a system of coordinates in which the equation is trivial. It's easy to solve. And it's called a complete integrable system. Okay. So these are, of course, a key ingredient to understand the solution. And so we would like to have the same for the damped beta Zeger equation. But in fact, when you add a damping term, you lose the Hamiltonian, the fact that it comes from an Hamiltonian. And you lose also the complete integrability, at least for beta different from 1. For beta equal 1, we expect that maybe it is completely integrable, but we don't know yet. But we have one Lax pair, which is which holds. And the Lax pair is related with the Hankel operator, the shifted Hankel operator, because if you take the solution of the damped beta Zeger equation and you compute the derivative of Ku, it turns out that it is du, the Lie brackets of a Q symmetric operator against Ku. So it is what is called a Lax pair. And the proof is easy. So I give you the proof. So you compute this derivative. It's the shifted Hankel operator of symbol du over dt. And so it is, you replace du over dt by minus I pi modulus of u square u plus minus beta minus the Hankel operator of symbol minus I, s, etc. And you have this damping term here. And the trick is that k kills all the constant, because k is the Hankel operator of symbol anti-shift, so it kills the constant. So this is 0. So the fact that there is a damping term does not enter into the thing. And from the computation for the Zeger equation, this operator, you know that it is the Lie brackets of Cu with Ku, and it remains the last term here. And this last term, you compute it by using the fact that K applied to S is just the Hankel operator H. So you forget about the S here. And here you recognize the Hankel operator, again the formula that we used before, but for the function S star u. So it's just B applied to S star u, H S star u, so it is this Lie brackets, and H of S star u is Ku. So you have this Lax pair formula. why it is so nice to have a lax pair? It's because when you have a lax pair, you can see from the equation that you have an isometry between, well, that Ku of t is isometrically equivalent to K of u at time 0. Hence, the spectrum of Ku is preserved by the flows, or, well, the flows when beta and nu vary. So it means that you have a large set of conservation law. You have an infinite set of conservation law. If you recall that we had 2 lax pairs for the Kubik-Zege equation, we have all the spectrum of Hu and Ku, which are preserved by the Kubik-Zege equation. Here we just have the spectrum of Ku. But anyway, and how does it work? So you solve this equation. Du is the skew symmetric operator, which was in the lax formula. You have this. And so you solve this operator valued equation. From this equation, it's easy to check that U is unitary. So you can prove that U star is the inverse of U. And at least formally, it's easy. You just take the derivative and prove that it is a constant. And the product of U and U star has a derivative which is a constant. And since you take the identity as initial data, then it is equal to the identity, and that's it. And the trick is that once you have this, you can prove this equation. And this is easy also because what you do is you compute the derivative of this function. And what you find when you compute the derivative is you take, it gives this formula, so that it is using this formula, it gives the result easily. Okay. Okay. So we know that the spectrum of, so you remember that I'm still trying to find all the properties of U0 such that the flow coming from U0 is bounded in Hs, so it has a limit U infinity in H1 half. And so now what we know is that the spectrum of Ku infinity is a subset of the spectrum of Ku0. Indeed, the spectrum of all the solution is preserved, but when you go to the limit, maybe some of the singular values may disappear by taking the limit. But at least we are sure that we have this inclusion. And in fact, we are going to prove that it is exactly the same, but it is the part which is not easy. Okay, so I just recall what we had before, all these properties. Then we have this one. Ah no, I told you a mistake. In fact, since the momentum is just the Hs norm of Ku, it is given by the Hs well. The Hilbert-Schmidt norm is given by the sum of the sigma square multiplied by the multiplicity of sigma when sigma vary in the spectrum of Ku. But since we know that the spectrum of Ku infinity is a subset of the spectrum of Ku0, and that we have this equality, we are sure that the spectrum of Ku infinity and the spectrum of Ku0 are the same. Okay, so this is easy. I said before that it was difficult, but it's not. It's not this part which is difficult. Okay. So now I turn to the much more difficult, well, more functional analysis part. To go further, I need to understand completely the spectral analysis of the Hankel operator, and we studied both the Hankel operator and its shifted. So we look at for U in H1 half, so that HU and KU are Hilbert-Schmidt operators, so they have eigenvalues. HU square and KU square have eigenvalues. So I look at all the family of the eigenvalues of HU square and KU square. I take the joint spectrum and I put these eigenvalues in a strictly decreasing sequence. So I take them with their multiplicity, and I take them strictly decreasing. Okay, and then I need to speak about some terminology. So we said that sigma square is an H dominant eigenvalue if sigma square is an eigenvalue of HU square with U non-perpendicular to the eigenspace of HU square relatively to this eigenspace, to this eigenvalue. And we do the same for K dominant with K replacing HU. So sigma square is a K dominant eigenvalue if sigma square is an eigenvalue of KU square with nu non-perpendicular to this eigenspace. Okay, so this it's not easy to remember, but the thing is that it is really funny from the min-max formula and the fact that KU square is just HU square minus this rank 1 operator. This is just because if you recall the definition of KU, it's S star HU, but it's also HU composed with S. Then when you compute this, it gives that formula. So you put these eigenvalues in a decreasing order, and it turns out that they appear as alternatively H dominant eigenvalue and K dominant eigenvalue. So it means that when I take the first one, so I mix, I take all the eigenvalues of HU square and KU square, and so I put them in decreasing order. And what I'm sure that S1 square is H dominant, S2 square is K dominant, and so on. And it alternates this way. And it's not easy to see why it is like this. It's really a long analysis to understand that. So it means that when you take the first one, it is necessarily of this kind. It's an eigenvalue of HU square with U non-perpendicular to the eigenspace, and so on. Okay. And also, the trick is that when you look at the multiplicity of the eigenvalues, the multiplicity of, oh, I did a mistake. Yeah. So if I look at the multiplicity of the first one, I denote M tilde to the other one, and so M1 is equal to M2. Let's see, M tilde 2 plus 1. So it means that, well, in fact, it's not so hard to understand, but it comes from the fact that since the eigenvalues of HU square and of KU square interlace, you have a first set of eigenvalues which are H dominant for HU. Then you have a set of eigenvalues which are K dominant, and so on. And I never know how to explain, but the multiplicity are, as I said, that m tilde 2 is equal to, well, I just prove it. So, well, okay. Okay. So, but the main consequence that you have to have in mind is that if you have an H dominant eigenvalue with multiplicity larger than 2, then it is necessarily an eigenvalue of Ku square, because the trick is that well, yeah, I should explain more because it's not easy. Well, so what I mean is that necessarily, yeah, well, it's not, well, okay. So I'm going to rewrite them in another way. Où est-ce que c'est? Où est-ce que j'ai mis? Ah, il y en a plein en fait. Okay, so if I rewrite them, maybe with another notation, I write them with the multiplicity. Sigma 2 square, sigma 3 square, and so on. What I claim is that I'm sure that if I take all this one, for instance, I imagine that this one corresponds to S1 square, and it has multiplicity 1, but it has multiplicity 3, excuse me. But by the interlacement property, we are sure that that one is an eigenvalue of Ku square. This is the interlacement properties. It says that when you put the eigenvalues in decreasing order, it is alternatively an eigenvalue of HU square and of Ku square, of HU square, of Ku square, and so on. So when you have, if S1 square, if it has multiplicity 2 for HU square, it means that it is also an eigenvalue for Ku square. And so you are done. And it is the main point here to understand that. So you have to not to forget that. And we are going to prove that it is the case which appears for U infinity, for our limit, so that we will conclude. Okay. And so it is a key theorem which says that all the eigenvalues of the limit that we consider, well, let's say, so we assume beta to be different from 1. We take the solution of the damped beta-Ségué equation, which are orthogonal to 1 on all the flow. So it is the case of U0, if you remember. And what we say is that this solution have H dominant eigenvalues at least of multiplicity 2. So as I told you, it says that it is an eigenvalues of Kv square, if I denote by V this function. And in particular, since I told you that Ku was, there was a Lax pair for Ku, it means that all the eigenvalues are preserved by the flow. So all the eigenvalues of the solution are preserved by the flow. They are conservation law. So the eigenvalues of Ku squared, we know it already because it comes from the Lax pair. But we get that the eigenvalues of Hu squared also are preserved by the flow. And so if you remember the formula I gave here, since we know all the eigenvalues of Hv squared and Kv squared, that they are all preserved by the flow, we get that this L2 norm is independent on the time, and it's given by the sum of -1 k minus 1 sigma k squared. The -1 to the power k minus 1 just comes from the fact that I told you that the multiplicity vary one to another by 1, plus or minus 1. Okay. And so this time we have the last characterization of our function u infinity. Its L2 norm is given by this formula, and this formula is independent on the flow, and it depends only on the spectrum of Ku naught square, so that we have our closed condition. Once we put all this together, we can read the exploding result I state at the beginning. Well, maybe it's so if you take f of u naught, this functional, which gives the L2 norm of u naught, if you assume that it gives rise to a bounded trajectory, then either the L2 norm is less than f of u naught. So in that case, you have that you can't have this property, because you should remember because nothing. If it explodes, the norm of u infinity is equal to this quantity. So if you are in this position, it's impossible. If it does not explode, excuse me. Or you can also have this which is not satisfied. So you have this equality, but the scalar product with 1 is different from 0. Then by the contradiction argument, you get that this goes to infinity. Okay. Okay, so the last thing is to say that the open set that you are going to consider is that one. If you take a solution in that set, so it is the interior of this set, then it gives a solution which are unbounded, whose norm in HS goes to infinity. What is funny is that this open set, so it is the open set that I gave at the beginning of the talk in the main theorem. So first you should see that it is an open set, and also that it's not empty. It's better, and but it's easy. What is surprising it is that it's completely independent on beta. But however, there exists function in that set which corresponds to for which S beta nu of u naught is unbounded in HS, but it corresponds to stationary solution for beta equal 1. So it's solution which does not move with time. So it's smooth solution. And so that's the thing. Okay, so I think I just have if I have just 1 minute left. I have 1 minute left. Well, 3 minutes. Or maybe, well, just to give you a flavor of what's going on here. So to prove, you remember that I would like to prove that the H-dominant eigenvalue has the multiplicity larger than 2. And in fact, we have to use all the spectral analysis that we did for the cubic Zegue equation dealing with Hankel operator and shifted Hankel operator. And it says that when rho is a dominant eigenvalue, H dominant eigenvalue, if you consider the projection euro on the eigenspace of HU infinity square, then you have the existence of some Blaschke product of degree m minus 1 if m is the multiplicity of the eigenvalues rho. And what you want is to prove that m minus 1 is larger than 1. And for that, it suffices to prove that psi, the Blaschke product, vanishes at point at 0. And this comes from the fact that you compute the scalar product of this function with 1, and you prove that it is 0. And so it's the way we do it. Okay, so after that, I think I can stop, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, so are there any questions? Yes.
You probably said that, but why do you need to assume that beta is not equal to 1 in the proof?
Yeah, no, I didn't say it. Well, it comes from, well, it's here that when we want, voilà, où est-ce que ça marche? Hein? Où est-ce qu'il est? Ah, when we compute, when we want to prove that the scalar product of this functional with 1 is 0, it turns out that what we have to prove is that all the powers of the Hankel operator are orthogonal to 1 along all the trajectory. And it turns out that it is true except for beta equal 1. Okay. And in fact, we think that beta equal 1 is really a singular point in all this family. And I think, well, we are working on it because we would like, for instance, to prove that it is a complete integrable system also, as the cubic Zegue equation. But and it's the most interesting case because it's the one where you kill the most interaction between, because bon. Ah, here. Yeah. You see that when beta equal 1, you have almost nothing as interaction, so it's the most interesting to understand what happens there.
Other question?
This
well,
time?
I have a very general question. Is where in physical problem, where is it used, the Zegue equation?
The Zegue equation is not used for the moment.
Maybe.
Yeah, because well, in fact we introduced this this equation because we wanted to understand the nonlinear Schrödinger equation in a flat, well, in bad geometry. And for instance, in fact, the cubic Zegue equation is linked with the NLS. I never know if I have to put a minus or a plus. So this, well, I think it's a plus. So this is the half-wave equation. This is much more linked with physical problem. And in fact, it comes first from this equation, and this equation is really close to it's the half-wave equation. It's the one, I'm going to say something wrong, so I prefer not to say, because in fact, but it's strange because it's in fact a lot of physicists work on complete integrable system. They are very interesting in, and not so many people in mathematics are interested in it. But it seems to be very exceptional, the structure of complete integrable system. But I think there are many things to understand in this area.
Okay, so once again, thank you very much for
Thank you.